Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to discuss dairy economics. Before we start, just a little housekeeping. If everyone can turn off their microphones, because otherwise we get a little bit of feedback. And don't feel like you have to put your cameras on at all if you don't want to. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box at the bottom, and then we'll get back and discuss them at the end. So yeah, tonight's talk is on dairy economics. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Rob Hitch. Rob is a partner at Dodd & Co Chartered Accountants, where he advises dairy farmers on all aspects of accountancy, tax, and general business affairs. Rob was instrumental in creating an in-house benchmarking service for Dodd & Co's dairy clients and has a keen understanding of dairy farming economics. Rob has also spoken at national conferences on dairy economics, succession, and some joint ventures. So yeah, I will pass over to Rob.
Thank you, Amy. See whether I can live up to that billing. Yeah, so I do have some slides which hopefully will work if I share screen. I will try and pull them up and then I can see how all this works. So bear with me. And I think I want that. So can anyone see that?
Yes.
That's all right then. Basically, so as Amy said, my name's Rob Hitch. I'm a partner at Dodd & Co. I've spent 30 years working in the dairy sector, basically advising dairy farmers, and now do accounts and tax basically, and business work with a lot of dairy businesses, probably sort of Birmingham North really. So we look after a lot of clients. I don't look after them all by any stretch, but we have a big group of dairy clients that we work with. I like to think that we probably work with some of the leading dairy businesses in the UK really. So with that in mind, I was asked to speak to your group, and what I was asked to do, because I think Oak Hill had a bit of a handle on, would like to know how much dairy farmers should be spending on vets. So what they asked me to do was talk a little bit about benchmarking, how that works, differences. So what I'd like to talk through is, if I can make this work, hang on, here we go. A little bit of scene setting, where we find ourselves, and then, basically what benchmarking is, large and small farms, what differences there are, how that plays out, house versus grazed, how those businesses operate, and explaining, what they need to be good at, and then really just using data at the end to finish up on. So if we start on that, I've got a wake you up slide and a scene setting session, which, here goes, see if it works. So we know that, we've had turmoil for the last 3 years with Brexit. We've got reams of things heading our way for farmers, whether it's support, subsidy, clean air, vegan lobbies, everything that is headed towards farmers currently just spells, massive disruption. And I think in practice, for most people alive today that are still in their working lives, we're probably going to see more change in the next 5 or 10 years than we've seen in the last 40 or 50. And that probably means that most of the people actively involved in running businesses through this period won't have seen anything like what's coming down the track. And I think that's probably quite key to remember. It will be a time of change, and like all things, change brings challenges, but it also brings opportunities. So in terms of doing that, I think, the important thing is we don't all end up just sticking our heads in the sand and worrying really that, there's nothing we can do about anything, therefore just plow on regardless, don't change, don't do anything, don't think about anything. The important thing is making sure that you are looking at your businesses and trying to work out what the best way of making that work is. Now, if we're talking, business performance, then these are sort of publicly available figures. This is dairy performance. It's quite old. It's from 1819, but this is produced from AHDB and basically shows the difference between the top 25% and the average groups in terms of dairy margin per hectare. So you've got all year round, the best guys making basically £1,250 a hectare, on an average about 300, and the grazing guys £2,000 a hectare as opposed to 1,000 on average. So there's a big difference between average and good dairy farm, sort of really good dairy farms. And remember, these are the top 25%. If you're creaming off the top 5 or 10, you're probably getting better figures again, slightly, albeit marginally. The one thing to bear in mind with all this, though, is that even if you're an average dairy farmer, that leaves you in a much better position than probably all of your competitors in reality on the West Coast. These are the same numbers from AHDB and effectively show, the sort of margins that are being generated out of beef and sheep systems, whether they're in the lowland or the uplands, and they are minimal compared with what's generated on your average dairy farm. So I think, everybody knows this is the reality. It's generally dairy farms that buy land. Banks aren't very keen on supporting others, and this is the reason why, effectively, if you're looking at margin per hectare here, the sort of sucklers and store cattle are all losing money. Sheep make a little bit, and SDA livestock farms make a little bit, but not hugely. So in terms of, if you're thinking of competitors, your competitors within the dairy sector might be the top 25% or the bottom 25%. But if you're in the dairy sector and you're competing for any other assets like land, then certainly throughout most of the west coast of England, where there's certainly in our area in the northwest, so through Lancashire and Cumbria, there is a large number of lowland red meat farmers who are on much smaller margins. So in terms of competition, we are everybody's competing with each other as a dairy farmer, but you're also competing with other farmers for access to land, whether that's from arable farmers or beef and sheep farmers. And at the moment, dairy farming looks streets ahead of those sectors and probably leaves all of them in quite a good, strong position, which is good news if you are a dairy farmer, not very good news if you're a big lowland beef and sheep farmer. So I think that, and we know that things are going to come that will change all these numbers, as I say, whether that's trade or whether it's support. So that sort of stuff's going to start filtering through. And if we're doing that, then I suppose the important thing is understanding your own business, where it sits in this hierarchy. And to do that, generally, we're looking at benchmarking things. So, I mean, benchmarking in itself is pretty straightforward. We want comparative data, i.e. access to, figures from your farm that are the same sort of under the same parameters as somebody else's farm, or some anonymized data that you can compare with. It needs to reflect the same time period, so there's no point particularly when you've got fluctuating output prices, comparing one period from, there's a period from, let's say 2020 with a period from 2019 from somebody else. We need to be looking at the same sort of time periods, and the analysis that you do and that you're comparing with needs to be robust. It's quite easy to put things in a different column and not include them. So we've all got to be sensible that the numbers that go into records are in the right place, so that when we are comparing them, we're not inadvertently showing one thing rather than another. And the easiest way of doing that is by doing full analysis right down to the bottom line, and then there's no room anywhere to hide. Every cost's got to be in somewhere, even if we've got it slightly in the wrong column. So in terms of benchmarking, what does it look like? I'd be interested to know, and I think hopefully Amy can run a poll. I don't know where everything is now because I've lost Zoom, but if Amy could run a poll, I was just wondering how many people that are on this Zoom call tonight actually have access to either monthly or quarterly financial data of their own. And if you can run that, Amy, that would be great. I'll presume that you are doing.
Yeah, it's running now.
Oh, there it goes. So we'll see how this goes. How long do we give it?
Well, as long as you like.
Everyone's voting, so we'll be all right. So.
No.
Yeah, so that's 8.
Yeah.
3/4 of people voted. No more takers.
I'll give it a couple more seconds, and we've had a minute. If anyone wants to reply. No, I will end it there then.
Okay, so we've got 80% of you actually having access to data. I should probably ask a follow-up question. Can you do that, Amy?
Oh, I don't know if I can, if I'm honest, because you need to do the polls before the Zoom. So
right. No problem. I was just seeing those results, so I just thought I'd ask another one. But if we can't, we can't. But
I can edit. Oh no, I can't do that.
That's fine then. So if 80%, well, I was just going to say, if 80% of you have access to data, how many already use it for benchmarking? But if we can't ask that question now, we'll work out whether you can sort that, Amy. If you can't, then it doesn't matter.
Will do. I'll have a look.
Okay. So in terms of, can I just quit that? So in terms of benchmarking data, where do we get to? These are the numbers we use in the accounts we do. So these are basically average figures, and these are a very average set of figures. So what we're doing in the purest sense here, in terms of when we look at things with our clients, we're doing a set of accounts for them at the year end, and then comparing them with the average of the sample that we have, which pretty much reflects all of our clients. So it includes very bad ones, very good ones, hopefully not very many bad ones, but generally reasonable farms. So it depends what data you've got to go into these figures. So we're breaking down milk sales, basic payment, all other income, cattle sales, fits, anything else you can think of. Variable costs broken down. We do this in the way that gives us most access to data. So I think in terms of benchmarking, you could drive, you can, and we have clients who split out their cost centers much more detail. So they might have feed between young stock and cows and then dry cows. And if you've got all that and all your peers have that you're comparing with, then you can do that. So, the amount of data that you can analyze depends on the amount of data both you and anyone else collects. And that's probably the key thing. So we have these simplified a bit because it's limited to the least amount of data that we can get from people, or the most amount of data we can get from the ones that have the least data. It's probably the best way of phrasing it. And you can, so you can compare you're comparing your business with average, essentially. These are all made up numbers because they're just done off for an example set of accounts. So basically, variable costs, gross margin, machinery costs, labor costs, property costs, sundry bits and pieces, bank interest. We still have amortization of milk quota. Obviously, that's long gone. Still a little bit of basic payment entitlement. And then also drawings and tax at the bottom, so that all costs are included. And then you can see we end up with a sort of break-even milk price of just sort of 30p in there. And sort of our average numbers over the last couple of years have been about 28.5. So that suggests that to stand still and carry on investing, that's the sort of money that you need to be at. And I suppose when you're benchmarking, you're trying to look at ways to examine those costs and drive them down. But getting to that point is probably key. So if you are once you start benchmarking, it's then understanding what you're comparing with and what's your target sort of sets of businesses to compare with. So if we are looking at large and small herds, then where does this sort of filter through? Now, I haven't got a lot of data on these slides, but hopefully you can see it all, because otherwise I was trying to squeeze too much into one page and it'd be so small no one would see it. But so in these businesses, the small herds average just short of 140 cows, I think 138, and the large ones were averaging 128 for the small herds and 540 for the large herds. So they're the sort of extreme of our sort of businesses. So on average, these guys have got 540 cows. On average, these are at 130 roughly. The small guys have more output. They have slightly higher variable costs, slightly better gross margin, slightly better power and labor costs. And other than that, sort of premises costs and things keep going up. Probably more a reflection of scale more than anything. Sort of over premises costs and sundry costs just go up with as output comes down, on a unit cost basis. But certainly power and labor and variable costs, which are the key drivers of profitability on dairy farms, are very little difference between them. Slightly lower in power and labor, slightly higher for variable costs. So if you look at that, you're looking at a profit down here pre-rent and finance of nearly 10 pence a litre on small farms, and probably just short of 7 pence a litre on the bigger farms, which equates to those numbers, sort of £800 a cow and £540 a cow, which doesn't look too bad. And if we look at how that's made up and the key areas where it's derived from, if you're actually looking at small and large farms, and I don't think this will surprise you, but the larger farms generally have a better milk price, but have an awful lot less income from cattle. Probably more as you get bigger, you tend to specialize a bit more and get a bit more focused on one sector rather than another. So not as much other stock kept or run on and reared and sold fat. Probably, calves and no surplus young stock, and calves on the whole start getting sold younger so that they're not carried through to bigger values. Basic payment is worth almost twice as much on the smaller farms. Other subsidies, which will be stewardship and that sort of stuff, broadly similar. And then the smaller farms tend to have a lot of other income, whether that's contracting, bits of work, bits of rent, feed-in tariffs, anything else that's driving that. So you can see where the smaller farms, broadly, most of their extra income is coming down here from non-dairy stuff. But actually their extra cattle sales pretty much wipes out the deficit in milk production, in milk price, which is fine. In terms of variable costs, there's there's 2.5 pence difference again between the small and the large ones, mainly through feed and fertilizer costs, as particularly if you get larger and you're not running lots of stock, you're not feeding other animals that aren't on the farm effectively, which is probably where the smaller ones end up losing it. Now a mouthful of tea. Other costs which you might expect to be different, which aren't. Vet and med and AI and semen seem broadly the same. Haulage is obviously broadly the same. That's a reflection of litres collected. And sort of general dairy costs are broadly the same. So there's not huge differences between large and small farms when you start looking at those numbers. And it probably follows all of the all the stuff that you see from people like AHDB, who quite often make a very big point of saying that it doesn't matter how you farm, and it doesn't matter how big you are, everybody can make a reasonable amount of money, or everyone can achieve the same sort of costs. And I think when you look through this, you can certainly see that overall the costs on small and large farms are similar. So that in itself doesn't make a huge difference. But once you start moving on from that, we end up in a position whereby if we started with our profit pre-rent and finance, we obviously have to have rent and grazing costs added in. But the big elephant in the room is essentially drawings and family labour. To a large extent, most of the smaller farms are run with less employed people and more family members, and most of the wage bill is reflected in the drawings that the families take out of those businesses. And I think, when you look at these numbers, then the difference here is that the drawings on small farms were 3.5p a litre, or 35,000, and to give you £35,000, and on the larger farms were 1.50p to give you 65,000. And that's probably the one thing that is more than anything driving farms to get bigger or to produce more output. The fact that if one family is living out of it, you can make a big difference in the amount of drawings that are taken out. So, if you take it in its simplest form, if you're producing 500,000 litres of milk and you would like £50,000 of drawings, that's 10p a litre. Probably unsustainable, but if you're producing 5 million litres of milk, it's only a penny a litre. And that's probably what's driving more than anything, to my mind, the expansion of dairy businesses, as they've just, and it's been happening for hundreds of years. It's nothing new, but it's probably that keeps driving it forward. The other costs broadly everyone can do similar, but we have to be mindful that at the end of the day, everybody's got to live comfortably out of these businesses, and to do that, they've got to be of a sort of critical mass really to be able to provide that. So that's probably what's driving people getting bigger. And when you look at this, there's probably not a massive difference between the big ones and the little ones, other than they spend, that they can average their drawings over a lot more number of litres, which reduces that cost per litre. So if we take the view that it doesn't really matter how big you are, then the next sort of question is, does it matter how you do things? So we have quite a lot of bigger dairy businesses that are very specialized that we deal with, and for them, and using a lot of their data, we do housed and grazed figures. So if we move on to housed and grazed numbers, which are quite interesting, if you're looking at rent costs, well, and these are sort of made up numbers as an example, so you can shoot me down in flames if you want. So we've got rent at £500 a hectare, basically £200 an acre. Stocking density, well, if we say 5 cows per hectare for the intensive housed units, we've got some stocking at much higher rates than that, and some stocking at slightly less. The grazing guys are generally, if we say 2.8, and if either of them go up a bit, it sort of moves in proportion. But the house guys are producing, as we said, 10,000 litres, so effectively 50,000 litres a hectare, whereas the grazing guys are only producing 5,200 litres, or just short of 15,000 litres a hectare. So of our £500 a hectare rent, we're effectively ending up with a penny of rent on the house guys and 3.4 on the grazing guys. And I suppose if you start factoring that difference of 2.5p in with 2p on the saved, 2.5 pence less in rent, 2p less in fertilizer, then all of a sudden the feed cost difference becomes much more manageable. And to a large extent, it's whether we should, or whether farmers should be looking at feed as the cost, or given that part of it comes from homegrown forage, whether sort of rents and fertilizer use should all be factored into that feed cost. Because I think if you add the rent differences in, it broadly brings the housed and the grazed units back in line, which is probably quite key. So that's where they run. And actually, when you get to the bottom line on it, they're both making quite a lot of money. As we said, roughly £500 a cow before rent and finance. And that is leading the good ones to just carry on investing in their businesses, whether that's growing slowly, modernizing equipment, or doing whatever. So, but I think, when we look at the data, and when you see how farms work, it's very easy to see how dairy businesses work when you look at the data on the sort of very large specialized units, because they're generally got their, they know what they have, a plan, and it works. And it's quite easy to see that the options, what happens if you graze, or what happens if you're housed. If you're not in those sort of setups, it's much harder to sort of split out what's contributing and what's doing what. But you need to be quite big before you start to probably see all that simplification and structure. On the whole, people always ask me how big you need to be a housed unit and get any economies. And I think my view is probably you need about 800 cows on a housed unit. You can probably get away with 400 cows on a grazing unit. to get this, to before you hit the sort of maximum economies of scale. So there's a big, these are big farms to make any real inroads into how they're structured. So if we've got all that data, I suppose, and we know where we're at, what do we do with it? So back to a wake up slide and back on the bomb. And then, if we've got data, we've got our benchmarking numbers, I suppose it's a question of looking at how we utilize that. If we understand how our business works, what the implication is if things change. So, I mean, this is just on basic payment. We know that basic payment's going to go, albeit over the next 6 or 7 years. And we know that that will have an impact on the bottom line of farms. But how much will it be? Well, we know from the numbers we've got that on average farms, it's probably worth, on smaller ones, 2.5 pence, and on bigger ones, 1.3. That reflects 6% of output on the small farms and only 3.5 on the larger farms. But interestingly, on all those units, it represents about 28% of profit. So that's quite a drop in some of these businesses. If we were talking at the beginning on those sort of farms of, small farms with profits of, even at £800 a cow, then losing 30%, nearly 30% of that knocks £300 a cow out of the system. So, these are big hits for businesses to take. As we said, the basic payment, because of housed units tend to be much more intensive in terms of production per hectare, the actual value of the basic payment is significantly less than it is on a grazing unit. So you're seeing, it's a fraction of output, just over 1%. And actually, if it all goes, it's a reduction in profit of about 8% on housed dairy businesses. But if we're taking it out of grazed businesses, that potentially reduces their profit by 20%. So roughly a penny or a penny and a bit. Now, given the amount of rent that most of these grazing businesses pay, and particularly given George Eustice told everyone yesterday at the NFU conference that rents would fall because they have to, then you would imagine they'll recoup some of that drop in basic payment through lower rents, which presumably will, happen over time. I know, talking to a colleague earlier who said one of the Savills things had said that, a lot of tenant farmers expect to take the basic payment retirement package and hand in tenancies. So we might find that rents fall relatively quickly if a number of people go down that route. So, and that obviously would probably mean that rents drop to the same extent as the loss of the basic payment. So probably the specialised guys, the big housed and grazed units, won't notice a huge amount of difference. I suppose the problem for a lot of the general ones, particularly the smaller end, is they don't spend an awful lot on rent and don't rent a lot of ground. It tends to be owner occupiers, so there's no way to recover that money if it's lost from the top line. There's no expense that it's covering effectively that will go away with it. So these guys probably won't see much difference, but these, the sort of average composite sort of units probably will, particularly where they've got no substantial rents to be able to offset the basic payment loss. Obviously, everybody's waiting to see what Elms does, but as Eustace also said yesterday, Elms will lend itself to more money for upland farmers that don't farm and less money for lowland commercial farmers that can earn money out of farming, which doesn't sound like it's a recipe for dairy farmers to get huge amounts of support. I did have on here, particularly for Sam, who was going to speak, but he isn't now, a little bit on vets costs. And this probably comes back to, you know, what data can you access as well? Interestingly, you know, if you, and it doesn't matter what you take, but I suppose vets costs on here were on small and large farms very similar on a pence per litre basis. And they're actually bizarrely producing almost the same amount of milk. So the average of all our large farms yield was 8,028 litres, whereas the average of all the small farms was 8,020, bizarrely. So pretty much the same, or basically exactly the same. And consequently, vets cost on here, both on a pence per litre and a pound per cow basis, are roughly the same. And I think you can, you know, from that, you can sort of see that you know, there's not much within it. The one problem we do have is a lot of these businesses, we don't have the split between semen and AI and vet and med. So it's just lumped in one figure. So if you are comparing things, it's important that you can compare the right bits. On the housed and grazed units, we have more data, generally because they're keeping more detailed records, and the breakdown then between what's semen AI and what's actually vets cost. So we're seeing on there vets costs are broadly a penny, but again, it's much the same on a pence per litre basis. But obviously with the big yield differences, that makes a huge difference in terms of pounds per cow spent on vets. So, you know, in reality, the grazing guys are spending £50 on vets, whereas, well, if you stripped out £30 of semen from the small and the large herds, they're spending £120 on vets cost per cow. You know, so there's a huge range in vets costs. I suppose they're doing a higher yield than the grazing guys, but they're actually doing lower yields than the specialist house guys without, and actually still paying more for vet costs. You know, so it's picking things out, and if you start getting enough financial data of your own, sort of pulling that together, comparing it with the right bits, and then looking to see how that fits or where you can make gains, really, as to where that goes on. So if we're summarizing that, you know, in terms of benchmarking and where we get to, effectively, you know, if you're looking at your own financial data and benchmarking it against either industry standards or another group, it helps you understand how your business runs, where the cost centers are, where the pressures are, you know, what it means. And a lot of these things, you know, variable costs are quite easy to change. You can up feed or drop feed. Does it have an impact on yields? You know, can you replace it with forage? But a lot of the fixed costs, particularly machinery and more so labor costs, tend to be reflected in sort of building design and layout, cow flow, those sorts of issues, which drive a lot of those fixed costs. And actually, if you look at a lot of the, you know, the people that have driven those costs down, i.e. the big specialist housed units, they tend to be in much more modern say more modern, not necessarily super modern, but in more modern setups with big open buildings, good cow flow, and ease of maneuverability of cows and vehicles and staff, which makes drives those costs down. Whereas a lot of smaller farms or older setups are just difficult to work, so you end up with much higher labor costs. But I think the important thing is, once you work out what your business is, you can use benchmarking to compare with others and effectively evaluate what the impact of, any potential changes is. So we know, you can easily see if you can, get to the, the sort of, if you're spending 1.2p at the vet and, your grazing guy's spending 50, if you can get to their sort of level, then we're back down, saving £70 a cow or penny a litre nearly. So all that sort of helps. You can use it to sort of pick out those areas, see where you can improve and do bits and pieces. But I suppose the important thing is probably, if you're going to benchmark in a group. And I suppose there's quite a lot of people that have done that well. Probably a lot of the grazing groups do a lot of really good benchmarking and compare things quarterly, and disclose all the financial data every year. But it's having that group. We've got clients who do it in groups of 3, where they just share a bit of data between themselves and go around each other's farms and sort of pick holes in it. But once you've got that data, it's quite easy and it's quite nice. Well, not necessarily nice, but all the people I speak to say it's quite, good being in a little group, people you trust, that you can look at each other's data and walk around the farms and actually start to think, well, why are you spending this much less than me on that? What are you doing? And you can people start asking the right questions then about how do you set, how do you not spend this much money on that everybody else is? So I think they're the sort of big benefits of it. And, it's broadly just a question of, more than anything, using data that you're probably already collecting and have access to actually provide better business information and better business data. We're seeing lots more people now, particularly with the advent of the sort of cloud software and bits and pieces. So a lot of development into how to make software better. But obviously, if in the old days, if you were doing your records in a cash book and it had 15 columns, you would have 15 different cost centers. If you're doing it on a spreadsheet, you can have as many as you like. If you're doing it in a computer package, you can generally have as many as you like. And the advantage of computer packages is you can pull out profit and loss figures every month or quarter. And then it suddenly allows you to compare those and monitor data all the time and compare it with, like-minded businesses in the same sort of setup. So we would suggest people do that where they can, and just be careful, make sure though that if you do start benchmarking, you're benchmarking against the right sort of businesses, and you're comparing apples with apples and not apples with pears. So, if you're running a grazing unit, compare yourself with other grazing units, whether that's a spring or an autumn block. If you're running house systems, look for, good house operators to benchmark with. And otherwise you're looking for sort of a decent cross section of people to start sharing data with. Now, whether you do that amongst yourselves, or people within your group here do that already, or any of you are friendly enough that you sort of say, what, we'll give it a whirl and we'll all disclose warts and all our numbers. It's quite a big precipice to step over to start with, when you're having to share financial data about your own business with other people. But I think it's like sending data to the bank or to your accountant. Once it leaves your hands, they're bound by confidentiality, and if you're in a benchmarking group, you've got to be absolutely bound by confidentiality, that the numbers that you share and see don't go any further. But if you can do that, probably makes a lot of sense. So I think I've probably got to the end of my talk, and if I can stop sharing this, I'll hand back to Amy and see if there's any questions on any of the above or anything else.
Hello again. No, thank you very much. That was very interesting. If anyone has any questions, if they wanted to type them in the box, or you can ask them out loud now. I do have a couple of questions already. Do you notice that farms that do their own AI are more profitable than farms that get a company in?
I don't think so, no. You know, to some extent, we've seen a lot of people move to things like RMS or whatever, any other proprietary brand of AI and heat detection services. And the one thing that is important, the one thing that I always say to dairy, but to all dairy businesses, is regardless of how or what you're trying to do, whether it's, you know, high yields from forage, whatever the plan is, there is a way of doing it as long as you follow the outlines. But the one thing that drives profitability on every dairy business is fertility. And, you know, the best will in the world, if you don't get things in calf, you will make less money. And, you know, if we look at if I look at the model of the grazing guys, it's dead easy. It's brutally obvious. You know, you carve everything on the 1st of February. And if they don't carve on the following 1st of February, you've cocked up in a big way. And unfortunately, because they're all outside, all your neighbours know. So it's not very pleasant. If you've got cows in a shed or you carve all year round, I think it's much easier to lose sight of fertility issues and and consequently calving interval, whether you use calving interval, preg rate, whatever you're using to measure fertility. But if I look at the sort of housed units we deal with that are generally probably selling 10 to 10,500 litres, they're generally working towards year after year calving intervals around about 380, 385 days. So slightly more than a year, but not very much. And that is, that's the key thing. And if whatever you do, which is probably why things like RMS, where people have been poor at fertility and serving and AI, getting somebody in that can do it has driven better fertility and better preg rates, shorter calving intervals, and that in itself drives profitability. So I don't think it matters who does it. It's more a question of how good they are at it.
No, thank you very much. And we've got another question in as well. Do you notice any difference between like robotic and milking parlour farms?
That's an interesting question, because we just spoke the other week about trying to pull some robotic data together, which I haven't got. I mean, we do have a number of people just running robots only effectively. And I think most of the variable costs stay the same. The issue is probably the capital costs, so you end up with a lot more depreciation. I'm not sure you get quite the savings that everybody expects, so I always think that if you're buying a robot for £80,000 and it lasts 15 years, it's losing broadly £6,000 a year, £5,000 or £6,000 a year. It probably comes with electricity costs and service costs of £6,000 or £8,000 a year. And when you start doing that, you're almost getting up to the same cost of a man, so they can work, but, and I'm interested, and we've had people ask us, what about larger scale robot units? I think they look fantastic on little herds, 120 cows, 2 robots, 1 man, because 1 man couldn't run 120 cows without it. But when you get up into bigger herds, you still need staff. You've got to get things in calf, you've got to trim feet, you've got to get the odd one out of a cubicle. There's all that sort of stuff which a robot won't do. So it's driving enough saving from, you know, they're sold on the basis that you save labour, and it is doing that. Unfortunately, we see quite a lot of people who put them in and spread labour out, you know, so you end up increasing costs rather than reducing it.
Thank you very much.
If we get round to pulling it together, the robot data, I can maybe send you a summary of it so you can share it.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you. Are there any more questions? If you think of a question after the talk and we've already ended it, feel free to email us and we can always get them answered a bit of a later date. But yeah, last chance for questions for now. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I found it very interesting. And yeah, our next talk is on Thursday, the 18th of March at 7:30, where we'll be discussing TB and how to keep Lancashire TB free. And that'll be with Susie. So I look forward to seeing you all then. So thank you very much, Rob.
No problem. Thank you. Hopefully everybody found it reasonably informative and interesting.
Yeah, it was great.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.